Welcome back to the Red Duna series with me, Colin Votier. What you're seeing now is the launch of our second of 4 satellites that will be our 600-kilometer coincidental communications network. And this network's just going to add some redundancy to our equatorial low orbit network that we put up last episode. After this, I will be launching 2 satellites that will be in polar orbits, one north and one south. That's highly eccentric. And we're going to use the fact that at periapsis those satellites move significantly slower in order to make sure that they're spending most of their time further away from the planet. High eccentricity means that they will not be easily eclipsed, and they will have our long-range communications on them. The rocket and payload themselves are identical to the ones that we're using in our equatorial constellation. However, we are starting at a different heading, so I rotated it in the vehicle assembly, and you can see that on the launch pad. Here I'm pointing out the payload because there was one small change to this rocket, which was that I added a probe core on the OIS for proper deorbiting this time around. What you saw there was I released the solid rocket boosters a little prematurely. Now that was accidental, but it's not unlike what we do with the space shuttle, where the solid rocket boosters are separated before they flame out completely, so that their thrust can push them up and away from the shuttle itself. You can see here I'm beginning to throttle back for a gravity turn. As we approach our apoapsis, the pitch of the rocket will drop, and when we get it to where we want it to be, we throttle back up, and by then we'll have passed through our max Q. Then we have Nico. I'm just gonna coast along here for a minute. And staging. And there we can see a beautiful stage separation. We've got those retros firing, pulling the booster away, and the OIS heading up out of the atmosphere. Now I do tend to ramble a bit while I'm recording, but I was listening to what I was saying and I did actually say something kind of interesting, so we're gonna flick back to old me to hear what he has to say. I've been thinking about installing engine igniter, but the whole thing about hypergolic fuels that doesn't really take into account with real fuels is what's putting me off. Hypergolic fuel is a fuel where when the two halves of the fuel come into contact, they spontaneously ignite. So engine igniter adds finite ignitions in an engine, assuming that you have like ignition charges to start the rocket burning. But with hypergolic fuel, you don't have to worry about reignition limitations. So that could be... There is a way to integrate it, but it's probably conflict with some other mods. I know the guy who makes the mod that it's most likely to conflict with, and his mod is probably the best way of integrating it. So maybe I'll talk to him and see if we can work something out. From there I'm going to fast forward a bit, because you guys have all seen this before with the equatorial satellites. Now we're coming up on our circularization burn, and I am setting my engines up and bringing my computer out to create our circularization maneuver. But of course there was one thing I overlooked. I still had my engine thrust turned way down so that I could fine-tune my apoapsis. So once we bring that back up, we are good to go for circularization. And that gives us our apoapsis and periapsis at about 600 kilometers each. Now I did clearly overshoot that maneuver by a little bit there, but the whole point of these satellites is for them to show up at unexpected times to fill in gaps. So an eccentric orbit is not necessarily a bad thing because it'll change its relative position. Now that we've come around to our apoapsis, we're at our highest point over, so we are going to separate the OIS and switch to it, where we can then use the probe core that I added in order to retroburn that and deorbit it. Now it's important that we make this as efficient as possible because I did not leave much fuel at all in the tank, and the separators are not going to deorbit it from this altitude by themselves. What I did overlook that helps us out a lot here is that once we've separated the payload off, the OIS weighs a lot less, so that little bit of fuel gives us significantly more delta V than I had anticipated. So now that we've got that suborbital, we're switching back to the satellite, cleaning up our orbit with the onboard fuel, and renaming it, and then doing the same thing with our other eccentric satellite, and that will do it for this episode. I know it was a short episode, but I will be putting up another one later this week to make up for that. I just didn't have as much time this week to do... Well, no, that's a lie. I had plenty of time to do video editing. What happened was I got Destiny, and then after getting Destiny, decided to try and make the Sparrow S10, the little speeder bike thing from it, in KSP. So I'll be putting up a bonus episode with that in it as well. So you can look forward to that later this week. Otherwise, I will see you back here probably next Tuesday. See you then, guys.